We have Jessica Burbank in the studio with us. Welcome, Jessica. So nice to have you on my left, and I still have Briahna on my other left. And what's going on?
I'm on the people's left. You're on his actual left.
Right.
Everything's left in the studio today.
Yeah, I was like, can I come have a play date with Robby and Bri? And they were like, yeah, sure. So here I am.
Always happy to include another voice in our discussions. Last night, while giving an address, President Biden was interrupted by a rabbi with Jewish Voices for Peace. She demanded that he call for a ceasefire in Israel and Palestine.
Mr. President, if you care about Jewish people as a rabbi, I need you to call for a ceasefire right now.
Now, Biden responded to the protester saying, quote, I think we need a pause. A pause means give time to get the prisoners out, Biden said, per Pool reports. Meanwhile, while Biden has stood firmly in his support of additional military funding for Israel and has refused to call for a ceasefire, 66% of Americans support a ceasefire, and between 41% and 64% of Americans support sending weapons or military aid to Israel, depending on which poll you consider. On Tuesday, Colombia and Chile recalled their ambassadors to Israel, while Bolivia said Israel's attacks on the Gaza Strip caused it to break diplomatic ties with Israel altogether. At a press conference, Bolivian Deputy Foreign Minister Freddy Mamani said Bolivia decided to break diplomatic relations with the Israeli state in repudiation and condemnation of the aggressive and disproportionate Israeli military offensive taken place in the Gaza Strip, according to Reuters. Colombian President Gustavo Petro said the attacks on Gaza were a massacre of the Palestinian people on Twitter and argued it's called genocide. The head of state who carries out this genocide is a criminal against humanity. His allies cannot talk about democracy.
UN Human Rights New York Office Director Craig Mokhiber resigned in protest over the United Nations inaction in Gaza, echoing Petro's description of what's happening in Gaza as genocide. He noted, I worked in these halls through the genocides against the Tutsis, the Bosnian Muslims, the Yazidi, and the Rohingya. In each case, when the dust settled on the horrors that had been perpetrated against defenseless civilians' populations, it became painfully clear that we had failed in our duty to meet the imperatives of prevention of mass atrocities, of protection of the vulnerable, and of accountability for perpetrators. We are failing again.
Ooh, so it seems like the pressure is coming on all fronts. The international pressure seems clearly aligned even before this crisis, and with the interest of Palestinians getting some kind of freedom, self-determination, whatever you want to characterize it. It does seem like there's also a ramping up of domestic frustration here with this crisis that is really a sea change from prior decades and how the majority of Americans tended to unequivocally really side with Israel. Do you think now, some breaking news here, Dick Durbin seems to be the first senator to come out calling for a ceasefire. Do you think that some of these protests, like the one we saw with Joe Biden there and the rabbi from Jewish Voices of Peace, are actually starting to make an impact?
I mean, look, I think the American people are not at all eager to be involved in another costly war in the Middle East. I think they're rightly on guard for this conflict getting ever broader. I'm sure they're seeing the same civilian death casualty rates, the images we're all seeing, and are horrified by this and are probably wondering, is this really necessary? And is this something we should be paying for? Is this going to make our security better off? Yes, I think those are questions the American people are having. I wish our government would listen to them. There's no appetite for, especially for American ground troops, or some of the things that frustratingly many political figures on both sides of the political spectrum would seem easy. It would be easy for them to slippery slope themselves into yet another Iraq, yet another Libya.
Jessica, what do you make of kind of the volume of some of these protests that we've seen and how they're being characterized, I think most surprisingly, by some right media figures who are increasingly characterizing these people as anti-Semitic, even as when we saw with the case of the Jewish Voices for Peace protester, they're both with Jewish Voices for Peace and themselves a rabbi.
Yeah, I think it's ridiculous. I think that's exactly what's changing the tides for many Americans, because so many times in all of these conflicts, we're told to boil it down into black and white. These are the good guys, these are the bad guys. And I think that narrative is really flipped on its head when you see Jewish Voice for Peace taking over Grand Central, them wearing shirts that say Jewish Voice for Peace, ceasefire now. I think it makes most Americans who want to say these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, it's the Palestinians versus the Israeli people. Now they're saying, wait, this is a group of people who are Jewish. Israel is a Jewish ethno-state. They are against what their government is doing. It really humanizes the situation. And I think all of the solidarity that those who are protesting with Palestinians in these huge rallies that have taken over streets in Los Angeles, streets in New York, and all over the world, this sense of solidarity, I think, has emboldened a lot of voices to speak out on an issue that formerly you were just labeled an anti-Semite off the bat. You couldn't have a conversation about it. The U.S. was pro-Israel no matter what. It was really difficult to have a conversation. Now voices are just talking about the history of what's happened in Palestine and how Israel became a state. And I think once you learn that history, it becomes very easy to be critical of what Israel's doing today.
Well, right. Certainly the Jewish people protesting in favor of peace. I mean, peace is a noble goal. Peace is a goal everyone supports. I think some of the protesters are correctly described as anti-Semitic when they're again celebrating the terrorist actions that took place on October 7th. That doesn't characterize obviously these Jewish protests. It characterizes a lot of the student protest activity. So if everyone could focus on, yes, protesting in favor of peace and a ceasefire and the minimization of civilian casualties on both sides, I don't know where to look at. I know you're both looking at me like, no, you're wrong. I think that would be beneficial.
You mentioned a lot of the student protesters you believe are anti-Semitic, and I wonder which specific campuses, which specific protests you're thinking of, given the sheer volume of student groups around the country who have been advocating in this way, and the fact that most student groups are diverse, and I would suspect include Jewish students in them. I'm just curious what percentage you would guess of the protests would be rightly described as anti-Semitic. I think it's an important question to answer, given that you have governors of states, prospective presidential candidates, and other elected officials who are very specifically trying to strip speech rights from candidates, from students, and target them using anti-terrorist law on the basis of the belief that the majority and overwhelming swath of student protesters are, in fact, actually trying to raise money and fund and support terrorist activities.
And I support their right to protest, no matter what their beliefs are. I've said that over and over again. I oppose what DeSantis is doing then. But I did read the toolkit of the National Students for Justice in Palestine group, which is what got them in trouble in Florida with DeSantis. Again, I oppose censorship of this group. I believe they should be able to have their activism. But I read their toolkit, and it says, referring to the events of October 7th, that it's a historic win for the Palestinian resistance, celebrating people breaking down the barriers of the Zionist entity. It celebrates what happened on October 7th. So I consider that. I don't know how. You can tell me how big and influential this group is, but I assume it's a major student Palestinian activist group.
The Florida Palestinian
No, those
Club?
are the chapters of the national organization, which is the National Students for Justice in Palestine, which I think is the main student group that does that. This is like the local chapter.
I don't think the 50,000 people who were in the streets in Los Angeles were members of this student organization. I think the majority of the protesters are protesting for specific things, for a ceasefire, for the end of U.S. funding of Israel's war crimes in the region. They're protesting for an end of the occupation. And I think to label anyone who's protesting for the freedom of Palestinians and for the ending of a genocide is not someone who's protesting against the existence of Jewish people. It's not anti-Semitic to say that you want the killing of Palestinians to end. And I'm not sure why so many people are trying to make that connection. And it's shocking to me that on the nightly news, you'll hear so many excuses for Israel. And even John Fetterman has said, I don't support a ceasefire because I want Israel to do what it deserves to do. What does that mean? When you have 1,400 Israelis killed and you have people making excuses, senators and commentators saying, you know what? They have the right to do whatever they see fit in response to this terrorist act. But what do the Palestinians have a right to do after they've had their land stolen, so many civilians killed? And so I really think they're seeing these populations of people differently. When you care more about the deaths of 1,400 people versus the deaths of 8,000 Palestinians, that's absolutely why we don't have a ceasefire, is because they're treating these populations as if they're different, which is what happens at the beginning of every genocide.
And that's a really interesting question, Jessica, and I'll put it to you, Robby. What do you think Palestinians who've been living alternately in apartheid conditions or under occupation have a right to do to free themselves?
I think they should engage in protest, and they should try to persuade. It would be great if they could get rid of their own terrorist government that's in charge of their area. And I think we should. The international community should work on their behalf to reach a two-state solution or some solution. It's not that they can do whatever they want on their behalf. I'm criticizing specifically what Hamas did on their behalf, which is to indiscriminately murder a bunch of innocent people and then drag them back as hostages, which obviously is not going to lead to freedom or better rights for the Palestinian people. It's leading to the destruction of the Palestinian people. It's leading to 10,000 deaths.
So we talked about on this program.
It seems self-defeating as a tactic.
So we talked about on this program, there have been innumerable efforts at nonviolence protest, most notably the March of Return in 2018, where after protesting peacefully along the border wall, Palestinians were sniped at by IDF soldiers.
Just because nonviolence protest has not worked yet does not mean that terrorism is going to work. It clearly hasn't.
Robby, if I could just finish this point.
Okay.
So much so that you have hundreds of people who are amputees or who are injured for life because so many snipers were targeting and aiming at the knees and legs of these innocent people, including women and children who were protesting in that peaceful way. The occupation has been going on for 17 years. The broader occupation of Palestine has been going on for 75 years. There have been innumerable political efforts there is a long history of them being thwarted by right-wing political officials in Israel, namely Bibi Netanyahu, who has reportedly undermined efforts at a two-state solution. He has actively pursued the policy against international law and even pushback from the American government and under the Obama administration, if I recall correctly, of encouraging settlers to continue to populate the West Bank, making it harder and harder to have a contiguous land that could be called Palestinian.
It's just so obvious that none of that action, none of those things, all things I decry, give license to do what was done on October 7th, nor does it mean that the actions taken October 7th are strategically a good idea. They're very obviously not.
Do you think the actions taken on October 7th justify the killing of 8,000 Palestinians?
Do I think the
actions on October 7th by Hamas, do you think that justifies Israel's response, killing 8,000 Palestinians?
No, I think I've criticized Israel's response a lot. I'm not satisfied with their explanations for some of the targets they've had, including the refugee center, including the Christian church where some of Justin Amash's relatives were actually killed. But I think it's a false moral equivalency to say a state has no right to respond to a terrorist incursion on its border. Like at some point, it's just naive. Like any functioning government on the face of the earth would respond to an incursion like this with some level of retaliatory attempts to root out the group that did it.
And is Hamas
we
not
would
a
respond
government?
if
wait a minute. Is Hamas
Mexico did this in Arizona.
Is Hamas not a government that is responding to the fact of being kept in an open-air prison with no control over their economy, their water, their electricity?
Deliberate targets were innocents.
That is. I'm sorry. That has not been vetted out. That, I'm sorry, just has not. Hamas has said. Wait a minute. Hamas has said that it endeavored to strike military targets. It did strike many military targets, and that the fact of the open-air festival happening so close to the border wall was unanticipated.
Oopsies.
And even Israel, Israeli officials echoed the same thing, that was a last-minute change and nobody anticipated with all the planning in the world that all of those people were going to be there. So yes, hostages were taken, and there were also people in Palestine who were from various other groups and factions who took advantage of the attack and did what they wanted to do in the middle of all of that as well. So, but I think it's really important to note that it wasn't as though Hamas said, we're going to go and target a hospital, we're going to go target a UN school, we're intentionally going to kill civilians. If we're going to make a characterization about who has demonstrated a willingness to target civilians, it is in fact the Israeli government.
In their strikes, in their response to October 7th, they're not deliberately targeting civilians. They're targeting Hamas, and Hamas has embedded itself under a civilian population.
The Orthodox hospital where Justin Amash's family members were killed, that was an intentional Israeli strike, was it not?
Yes, and their explanation was that there was a Hamas entity.
In the largest refugee camp in Israel that was not struck once, It was not struck twice, it was struck 3 times.
They didn't strike it because it was a civilian population.
And yet,
they say they struck it because Hamas was there.
Right. So Hamas was there. Just like we could argue that when Hamas was going into Israel to strike its military targets, a festival was there.
And
so
then they started blasting, and then they started dragging people off.
And then Israel, with all of its technology and all of its precision, precisely targeted the largest refugee camp in Gaza.
A refugee camp that was hiding Hamas.
According to, okay. Even the IDF.
Or not, and it was a mistake and they shouldn't have done it. I'm not going to co-sign every action of the Israeli government because I don't support it and I don't want to fund it. But this false moral equivalency between the two is ridiculous. And in fact, I would have thought before we started having these regular conversations about Israel-Palestine, I honestly would have thought my views on the subject, which are not as strongly held as yours, I'm not as knowledgeable on the subject as you all are, I would have thought my views were like 90% in line with the left. And I don't feel that way after having these conversations.
Well, that makes sense, Robby, because I think what we just heard you say was that in response to what Hamas did, the Israeli government has the ability, the permission, morally, to strike back with military force.
Yes.
Right. And
does anyone dispute that?
Well, I think by that
is a big question.
By that same logic, Robby, if we think about the 31,000 casualties in 2018 when civilians were peacefully protesting, the Israeli government was targeting civilians.
In a single
but
year.
You don't believe that Palestine has the option, morally, to strike back militarily against that, but Israel does. So why does one population, you believe, has the moral permission to strike back with violence or military force? Israel, you think, does, but Palestine does not. They have to peacefully protest. They have to do it some other way. Why is that the case? Why do you draw the line that way?
Because what Hamas did is clearly terrorism and involves kidnapping. It's just, there's
Palestinians have been kidnapped by the Israeli government.
2.3 million people. It's not so says us. It's literally 18 humanitarian organizations.
They were dragged from a music festival?
No, that there's multiple generations of refugees that were forced off of their homeland in the Nakba in 1948 who have been living in a open-air prison in substandard conditions for generations. And for some reason, that doesn't seem to be striking.
You're never going to get me to say that what a terrorist group did on October 7th was either justified or a good idea, because it clearly wasn't.
I don't think we're asking you
so then what are we
to
arguing
say
about?
if it's justified or a good idea. I think I would say that I'm asking you to show the same grace and understanding about the motivations of those people as has been very easily extended to Israelis, even as they act disproportionately with more technology, more ability to be precise and actually hit their intended targets, but making the choice instead, because they don't want to sacrifice Israeli soldiers or whatever, to bomb known locations filled with civilians, knowing that for 3 weeks their targets...
But you're saying for Hamas that's a legitimate thing to do.
Knowing that for 3 weeks that their targets are going to result in 70% of the victims being women and children. No claims that the bulk of their targets are even Hamas. And you're expecting me, yes, I do hold Israel and all of its technology and the billions of dollars that we have sent it to a higher standard to avoid civilian casualties than a country that is not allowed to have a standing military, that cannot have bases in the open, cannot mount a campaign, that cannot control its own resources, has absolutely nothing, does not have an economy, cannot conduct trade with the rest of the world. And when they try to mount a liberatory act or something to bring the end to an occupation, to liberate the people who have been occupied.
How is that going for them?
That's such an interesting question. I don't know if you watched this, Jessica. It was going around over the last couple of days or 24 hours or so. Norm Finkelstein, who is one of the foremost scholars on this issue, both of his parents were actually in the Warsaw Ghetto and survived the Holocaust. He was engaged in a debate where he was asked this question about, well, was it even worth it? Was it even strategically valuable for Hamas to take these actions? And one point he raised was, in the wake of any number of rebellions, whether it's Nat Turner's slave rebellion, which was obviously unsuccessful insofar as it didn't end slavery, people have made that claim, that it didn't work. What was the point? You just brought all of this harm on the people that you were trying to free. But if you take a longer historical perspective and this was Nora Finkelstein's argument, and you see the way that Nat Turner influenced John Brown, influenced the abolition movement, influenced Frederick Douglass, you can draw a line between some of these smaller actions and the inspiration down the line that ultimately did lead to the liberation of a group of people. And when you look at I don't know if you had a chance to look at this as well, Jessica, the intelligence document that was leaked from Israel intelligence forces that they've confirmed is a legitimate and real intelligence document. They downplay it. They say it was advisory. It isn't necessarily true that we're going to do this, but it was a plan that at least was circulating. They very specifically speak to the fact that there has to be messaging, advertising to the Palestinian people as they are forced into the Sinai per one of these plans that lets them know that there is no hope for them, that no revolution will be successful, that this is the last straw, that you're being forced out forever. Because they understand on some level the psychological draw of thinking that we're going to have another bite of the apple. We can get to our homeland again. And they want this to be perceived as a more final solution. So I think the time will tell. In the grand scheme of this, maybe it will be a big loss of life that has no long-term effect.
It's not maybe. It is a big loss of life.
That will have no long-term effect.
I mean, we're tallying. I mean, I am horrified by the loss of life occurring on the Palestinian side. At some point, it's burning down the village to save it. Like the whole area is being destroyed. People are dying by the thousands, and for what? For some kind of independence in the future? This is the way?
We can't hold Palestinians.
I think you'd have to have a lot of confidence that this was going to work to think this was the right course of action.
I don't think we can hold Palestinians who are fighting for freedom, for liberation, for their land back, fighting for their lost loved ones. We can't hold them accountable for Israel's destruction. We can't say that your fight for liberation caused Israel to drop 6,000 bombs on northern Gaza and force the population living in Israel into Egypt.
That's exactly what it did.
No, it wasn't an agreement that was made prior where they said, Palestinians, if you come into our country and kill people, we're dropping 6,000 bombs on us. And then Hamas says, yes, thank you, that's a very good deal, we'll take that deal. That's not how it works. They are not responsible for Israel's bombing and killing of all of their people.
I mean, this human shield thing, Robby, I mean, another thing that's been kind of confounding me about that framing is we all watch TV. We all watch hostage shows. We all watch cop dramas or whatever. If I take you or one of your loved ones as a human shield in like a hostage, a really one-to-one hostage scenario, and the cops come and just mow down your loved one to get me, I think most of us see that as kind of villainous, and that the cops should do everything that they can to preserve the civilian life. The idea that, given the tragedy that just happened in Maine with the mass shooter, if they found out that the guy was hiding out in a packed suburban mall, that it would be worth it to drop a bomb in that mall and kill the hundreds of people inside just so that one shooter doesn't continue on his rampage, would be obviously...
No, I've literally said that on this show.
Okay, so
I agree
how
with
do you apply that analogy to the defense it seems you're making of Israel's actions toward Gaza?
I'm not making a defense of Israel's actions. I'm making a condemnation of Hamas's actions, which you two are eager to defend. So that's the issue. I'm happy to be critical of what Israel is doing. More than anything else, I don't want to have anything to do with it because I don't think the U.S. people should be responsible for it and they should not fund it. There's no disagreement there.
I guess the problem is that all of the condemnation seems to be coming after literally decades of silence on the fundamental condition of the people of Palestine. And so there was no...
Silence as the U.S. government's policy would be a market improvement. No funding, no support, no anything. We'll leave the people in that region of the world to work it out.
I understand that's your position as a libertarian whose investment in this extends as far as America's bank account. But for many people, they're invested in this conflict because they see a fundamental humanitarian crisis that has persisted for 75 years for the people of Palestine.
The Middle East would be a lot better off if we butted out of it.
Right. That doesn't change much for the circumstances of the people of Palestine. And so I appreciate that your interest might be limited, your political interest might be limited, but a lot of other people, either because they're Palestinian American, like Rashida Tlaib, or because they have family members there, or because they're Jewish people who feel like they're being made less safe by the antagonism between these groups, whether it's Israelis who feel less safe because of the reality of their right-wing government choosing to hold a pen of people next to their country who are disaffected and rightfully angry about their condition, want something fundamentally to change there.
Well, people are allowed and can express their free speech rights and can engage in protests, or they can send their own supplies, donations to either side of this conflict. I want the U.S. government, as a matter of policy, to butt out of this and essentially all other global conflicts for the good of our own security and theirs.
Robby,
and I thought we didn't disagree on that.
What do you think is going to happen if Palestinians have no support from the global community?
You're saying we should intervene militarily to help the Palestinians now?
No, I'm not. If Palestinians, if the lay of the land is everyone's on their own, Palestinians who are in these unsupportable conditions are left there by themselves. They've tried to protest, they've tried to appeal to the international community, none of that works. They've tried peacefully protesting.
Maybe they can appeal to one of the 20 Arab countries in the region for help then.
And they're about to get some backup from them, and we're about to be in World War III, so God bless to everybody. But
we don't have to be in anything. That's a choice.
I just really want you to play out the reality of what is going to happen. Whether it's Hamas, whether it's individuals, some other group, people living under occupation are never going to stop trying to be free, even if it means every last one of them die in the process. Every group that has been in captivity and been oppressed understands this. You don't stop fighting because the status quo condition of your existence is unsupportable, is unsustainable. And so if you want to get to the end of the violence, you're going to have to end the violence against Palestinians that they're resisting against.
Isn't that's like thinking Ukraine is going to defeat the Russian army someday?
As a libertarian, Robby, imagine if you were living in Palestine. Imagine if another country controlled the rights of the people living in Gaza, which, in this scenario is where you live. They have control over all of your borders. There's no airport for your people to freely travel. They control your electricity. They control your food. They control your water. What does that mean for the liberty of the people living in Palestine? What does that mean for their
Certainly
very
that it's
basic human
and
rights?
I feel for them, and I want full equality for them in some kind of political arrangement. I don't.
But they don't have the right to take up arms and free themselves the way that America did, the way Haitians did, the way we fought a civil war, a revolutionary war, the way Indians freed themselves from colonialism, the way that South Africans freed themselves from the Boers. All of these revolutionary examples involved violence.
Thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people will die, mostly on their end. So they should not do that.
The Civil War remains the most costly war for American
it was it's not a good thing. Well, I absolutely do not.
I'm pretty fond of it, because otherwise, Robby, I wouldn't be able to sit here with you today.
Well, plenty of other countries in the world abolished slavery without killing half their population.
First of all, it wasn't half the population. It was about 700,000 Americans, which was a very big death toll for us.
Abolishing slavery also created slavery. It was the invention of the draft, which is a form of slavery.
Well, I'm also not fond of the draft.
Yeah, this wasn't a policy win here.
This feels a little like we're leaping helter-skelter.
All right, well, you brought up the example.
No, I just mean to the draft feels like a little bit of a departure. But you do tend to say...
not to me, as a formerly 18-year-old male man.
I would just say that I've heard you say before that slavery in other parts of the world ended spontaneously.
I didn't say spontaneously. I said without a bloody revolution.
Without a bloody revolution. I really push back against that. The example of the very bloody Haitian Revolution was a cautionary tale across the world that set into motion abolitionist movements across the world, and none of those were without a lot of anguish, and in many instances, if not bloodshed by proxy because they looked at the Haitian example, actual bloodshed in those nations as people were fighting for their freedom. The people in the Warsaw Ghetto fought for their freedom. This is another example that Norm Finkelstein brought up, that nobody would ever argue, as futile as it was for those prisoners in World War II to resist the Nazis in the Warsaw Ghetto, nobody would ever make the case, well, they should have just laid down and died and not tried to fight for their own freedom. And it is an interesting thought experiment. You roll your eyes. You think that that's not a fair comparison?
In this circumstance, we're giving people false hope if we tell them that more acts of terrorism against the state of Israel is going to produce Palestinian liberation.
It's not about what we're telling them, Robby. It's what they feel and know and experience, just like the people in the Warsaw Ghetto knew that they had an existential drive to try to free themselves and save their lives.
This kind of action is going to result in your people getting bombed over and over again, your hospitals, your refugee camps. I don't want that. I don't want to watch it happen.
The Nazis are going to send you to a death camp, so don't try to resist your concentration camp.
I think the reality we have now is a population of 1.1 million people that are held hostage. We always talk about the hostages that were taken by Hamas, but a hostage is someone who is confined to a specific space, who is subject to brutality, whose movement is controlled by another person or people, who cannot have access to food and water unless the person keeping the hostage gives it to them. That's the conditions of the population of Gaza right now. They have 1.1 million people held hostage for the actions of Hamas, right? And we can argue back and forth as to whether or not that was justified. But let's think for a second about what a hostage has the permission to do in fighting for their freedom. They can't even do that because they're being bombed by Israel. And the United States' role in this has been funding Israel's military so that they can establish this hostage situation and strengthen it and make it so that they have an Iron Dome protecting them so that when Palestinians try and fight back, they can't. That's the situation we're in right now. And I know you would not like for it to be the case for the United States to have ever funded Israel's military. But that's the situation we're in right now. And that's why we need the government of the United States to call for a ceasefire, because otherwise we're complicit in everything that's happening.
I don't disagree. And I'm not, to summarize, because we really ought to go. It's been a long segment. I am not fighting back against military targets might be a different matter. I still don't think it is strategically wise and a good idea. Maybe there's some greater justification for it. But I don't think, again, the actions taken October 7th that involved so many innocent lives being lost on the Israeli side. I mean, then you guys come out with, like, look at what Israel is doing that's so bad. I'm like, yes, that is bad, and I think it should be limited and more proportional, and we should have nothing to do with it. But that doesn't. But then you shift to saying, well, they have to do this in order to liberate themselves. Again, they aren't those in contradiction?
No, like, do I wish that Hamas had the sophistication of an army that could do isolated military targets? Of course. It doesn't have that capacity.
Yeah, I wish they didn't exist, but.
Well, you can talk to Bibi Netanyahu about that one.
I think we have to deal with the world with how it exists today. We can't say, oh, well, I wish the Israeli government wouldn't do that. They're doing it, whether we like it or not, and we're funding it as a country. And I think that's what we really have to deal with, is it's already happening. We can't just say, yeah, I wish the Israeli government didn't do that, and I wish Hamas didn't do that. That's not dealing with the reality of the situation and how it exists. How it exists today is that Israel has one of the most sophisticated military forces in the world because of U.S. dollars. And the entirety of the United States.
I know you're not arguing with me when you're saying that, though, because I don't.
No, but Robby, I think you're trying to frame it as we're contradicting ourselves because you supposedly agree with us that Israel's actions are horrible. But we're saying that as a country, we need a ceasefire. We need the United States to stop supporting the Israeli military because it is an occupation. And we're talking about what Hamas is doing as a terrorist organization.
You're talking about living in the real world, being realistic. Neither side really wants a ceasefire. I mean, Hamas says it wants a ceasefire right now so they'll stop attacking them. But Hamas wants the state of Israel to cease to exist as it is now. They want to establish a dictatorship over the area that they control. And Israel doesn't want a ceasefire either because they want to eliminate Hamas. So
Hamas's most recent charter supports a two-state solution, for one. And for two,
that's not what
I
that spokesperson said when we played the clip of him the other day. He said all of Israel should be under their.
No.
They should be participating in all of Israel, and they're and they don't. It's not going to be like a secular democracy. They don't run Gaza that way.
Well, no, it's certainly not going to be a secular democracy because Israel is not a secular democracy. I do think most leftists believe it should be.
Gaza. Right, most leftists believe that, but it doesn't matter. I'm saying the combatants in this struggle don't want that.
Wait a minute. The fundamental problem here.
If I could snap my fingers and make it a secular democracy that has Palestinians and Israelis, I would, but neither side wants that. So what does that matter?
The Western media in Israel frames the root of the conflict as Arab hatred of Jews. That's how they frame it, that the fundamental problem is that Jews came to the region, returned to the region, and Arab hatred is what's fueling this conflict. I would reframe that. I would say that Arabs, Christians, and Jews have been living in the region for a very long time. The fundamental conflict is the establishment of an ethno-state that privileges the value of lives and the political participation of one group, Jewish people in the region, above all of those others. And then to have a campaign to demographically rig the territory as it continues to expand to maintain that demographic advantage so that you can have an ethno-state, a Jewish state. I don't think it's compatible. I disagree with a theocratic Muslim state or an ethno-state that's Muslim. I disagree with an ethno-state that's Christian. I disagree with an ethno-state that's Jewish. Because fundamentally, it is going to be an apartheid system.
Would you rather live under the Israeli government or Hamas?
I would definitely not want to live in Israel ever. And many people...
Would you rather your government be the Knesset or Hamas?
Well, Hamas isn't even allowed to have a government.
I mean, they are
Robby, first of all, that's an absolutely absurd question.
All right. Well, I was asked to address the parallels to the Haitian Revolution, but that's an absurd question.
Well, ask me. I don't know. I don't know what to do. I mean, I appreciate your engagement. It does feel like, and I know that you're saying that you feel like we don't have enough sensitivity to the loss of life on October 7th. I said when it happened, like the next day, and I meant it. We can sit here and it might be worthwhile to get a list of names and families and go through and talk about that loss of life. There's no hesitation for me as a humanist to engage with what it means for human lives to be lost. But what I do have an issue with is the way that we gloss over what it means for a community of people to live under occupation for multiple generations, mere miles away from houses to which their grandparents, some of whom are still living, have keys to apartments that are now occupied by people who had the right to move there from Brooklyn, New York, because the state of Israel said, as long as you are Jewish, you're allowed to come and live here. To me, that strikes my conscience as unethical and unfair. And that is the core of what's driving all of the tension in the Union. And all the other Arab states are looking around and seeing how America is propping up that reality. And so what are you going to do about that? The return to the status quo is inadequate. I think that's the fundamental tension. A reset to October 6th is not adequate for the people of Palestine and people who are wanting to advocate on their behalf.
Well, I don't disagree with that. All right, we'll have more Rising right after this.